Hey everybody, Pete Meyer, Motor Age Magazine here. The other day I saw a technician commenting in one of these Facebook automotive tech groups that I go to once in a while, and he was complaining about the number of times that people are being reminded to check power and grounds when they're facing some type of electrical problem. That is, until he had to test power and grounds and found out that his testing process wasn't quite what it should be. Are you testing power and grounds properly? And stick around and find out in this edition of The Trainer.
Today's edition of The Trainer is sponsored by...
Hey, Pete Meyer here, Motor Age Magazine. You've heard us talk all the time about the need for continuing education. How are you maintaining your education and competence in this field? Well, I got an answer for you. It's called Motor Age Training Connect. It's an online video platform that's customizable to fit your needs. Currently, there's over 350 videos in this portfolio, and there's 2 to 3 added every single month. The production quality is excellent. The animations are excellent. The trainers are experts in their field, and they're using the latest tools and technology to share these systems with you. Everything from fundamentals all the way up to advanced stuff, it's all part of Motor Age Training Connect. I invite you to learn more. Just log on to connect.motoragetraining.com. Whenever I'm asked for help troubleshooting an electrical problem, one of the first things that I ask the technician is, have you verified good power and grounds to the component that you're having a problem with? And 90% of the time, the answer is, yeah, Pete, I've got power and I've got good ground. But when I start asking a little more detail of how they tested power and ground, well, that's where I start to see where the problem lies. And I want to kind of clarify that. Let me demonstrate. Here we have a headlight circuit that's not working. I get a call, Pete, I've got a headlight circuit that's not working. One is, one's not. I put a new headlight in, it's still not working. Well, did you check power and ground? I sure did, Pete. Well, how did you check it? And this is not atypical of the kind of responses that I hear. Well, I grabbed my test light, Pete, and I hooked it up to the negative side of the battery. And then I disconnected the the headlight rather. So we'll simulate that here. And then I took my trusty test light and I turned the key on and turned the headlight on, and then I hooked it up and got a nice bright test light. So I've got power. And then I moved my trusty little test lead over to the positive side of the battery. And I went to the ground side of that headlight switch, Pete. And again, I got a nice bright, see if I can get that in there so you can see it good. Got a nice bright test light. So I've got good ground. So I don't get it, Pete. Why is the headlight not working? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First, what are we really measuring when we just measured this side of the circuit with our test light? All we measured was open circuit voltage, didn't we? It was no different than if I'd gone across the battery itself. Now, had there been a problem, if it was severe enough, yeah, you might see it. Maybe the light bulb's a little bit dimmer than what it should be, but I don't know about you, but my eyes aren't that good. I can't quite tell a huge change in resistance just from the quality of the headlight or the test light bulb. The other factor that comes into play is just what kind of bulb do you have in your test light? It's going to impact with the resistance in the circuit. And I think you'll see that as we go along, and you'll understand a little more as we go along. So how should the technician have checked the power and grounds? Well, let me put the circuit back together and we'll talk about that. If you watched the trainer video last month, we covered some electrical fundamentals. One of the things that we stated in that video was that all electric circuits have resistance. The wire has resistance, the connectors have resistance, but the only true, really source of resistance should be the load, in this case our headlight. Yes, there's resistance in those little connectors. Yes, there's resistance in that section of wiring, but it's marginal compared to the resistance represented by the headlight. The second thing we talked about was how voltage is used in the circuit. The voltage is needed to overcome the resistance in that headlight, to get the electrons through that component, through that resistance. And we know that all the voltage supplied will be consumed by that resistance. So I should be able to measure close to battery voltage going in, but I should measure very little coming out if everything's working the way it should. That's the whole idea behind voltage drop. The third thing we learned was that if there is another source of resistance somewhere in the circuit, for whatever reason, that it's going to demand its fair share. And if that's the case, that's going to impact the readings that we get when we check against our load. So how should you test power and ground circuits? Using voltage drop to test their ability to deliver voltage to the load and provide a clean ground path from the load. So let's do that with our multimeter next. I'm going to set my multimeter on the voltage scale, and we're going to do it first in what I would call a traditional, conventional method. Something that's easy to understand if you're new to voltage drop. And I'm going to place the negative meter lead on the negative post of the battery. And then I'm going to measure how much voltage potential do I have to work with, or does the headlight have to work with? So we're going to measure that first, and we measure 12.40 volts. Okay? With everything connected and the circuit operating on, even though it doesn't look like it, I'm going to measure the voltage going in to the load. I'm not going to disconnect anything, but I'm going to get as close to the load as I can and measure the voltage there. Here I've got 12.34. Okay, that's not quite 12.40, is it? That's 0.06 or 60 millivolts difference between the battery and that point in the circuit. Well, remember what I said? All the sources of resistance are going to share that voltage supply. They're going to take their fair share. So what that's telling me is that the connector, the wire, the connector are all enough of a resistance to consume that 60 millivolts, okay? But I have more than enough. That's marginal. I'm not worried about a small amount like that. So the positive side of the circuit's good. Let's check the ground side. Still have my meter attached to the negative side of the battery, but now I'm going to move my positive meter lead to the ground side of the load and measure the voltage present now. I'm measuring 12.24 volts. 12.24 volts. Well, that seems it's a violation of the rule that we talked about, isn't it? All the voltage supplied to the load, to the resistance, should be consumed with little or nothing left over. Well, I don't have a little or nothing left over. I got a lot left over. I got almost full system voltage left over, don't I? This is what often throws techs off. My meter leads are attached, ground at the battery and ground at the load. How in the world am I measuring voltage on that side of the circuit? All resistances in the circuit are going to take their fair share of the voltage. And it's not split up equally. It's based on the amount of resistance in proportion to the individual resistances, okay? What this is telling me is I've got a huge resistance between here and here that's taking all the voltage away from the headlight. And that's why the headlight doesn't work, because there's a thief in the mix. All right. Let's try another testing method that you can use that makes it even easier to spot which side of the circuit has the problem. I'm going to do a little something different here now. I'm going to move my meter to the millivolt scale, and I'll tell you why. Most meters have a 300 to 500 millivolt ceiling. In other words, they won't read past that millivolt range. What they will do is give you like all dots, dashes, or OL, or something like that that tells you you're over that measurable limit. What is the maximum allowable voltage drop in a circuit? For most general circuits, right around half a volt. Electrical circuits, a little less. High amperage circuits, like a starter, a little more. I don't want you to quibble over a few tenths though, okay? Like you just saw, if there's a thief in the mix, you're going to see it. You're not going to quibble over a few tenths. But by going on the millivolt scale and using the method I'm going to show you now, This is a go, no-go decision, all right? Let me show you what I mean. We're going to go back and test just like we did before. I'm going to check the positive side of the circuit first, but this time I'm going to remember positive, positive. I'm going to place my negative meter lead on the positive post of the battery. So just remember, positive side of the circuit, positive side of the battery. What I'm doing here is letting the meter do the math. The meter measures potential between its leads. In the first go around, we started off measuring the battery voltage, and then we checked the amount of voltage present here. We got a 60 millivolt difference, didn't we? But we had to do the math. We had to subtract the 1234 we got here from the 1240 that we measured here. I ain't got time for that. I just want a quick answer. Is it good or not? So I'm just going to put my positive side of the circuit, negative meter lead positive, and then I'm going to measure the same way I did before, my positive lead at the positive side of the connector. And there you go. I've got 60.8 millivolts. 60.8 millivolts. That's 0.06 volts, right? So it's the same reading. It's the same result. And because it's not showing me OL or anything like that, I know I'm within my serviceable limits. I don't have a problem on the positive side of the circuit, or at least not up from this point to the battery, okay? That's another point you need to remember. I need to get this probe as close to that load as I can in order to test the entire path. Now we're going to apply the same concept to the ground side. Ground side, negative lead, ground side. Positive side, negative lead, positive side. Okay, got that? Okay. So ground side, negative lead, ground. Positive lead at the connector, ground. OL. And that's all I need to know. OL. Out of luck. Problems on this side of the circuit. It's between these two test points. So as I start working my way back towards the battery, as soon as that OL goes away, I know I've passed the point where I have a problem. But now I have truly tested power and grounds. And it really took no more time than doing it with that test light, only my results are a lot more accurate. Okay, I think now you understand the basics on how to properly test power and grounds on an electrical component. But what happens when we're dealing with a little more complex electrical component? You know, there are so many electronic control modules, little computers, that are on the vehicles today. It's vitally important that you first perform a valid power and ground test on these components before you pull the trigger and replace it. After all, like any other electrical component, if it's not getting a good clean source of voltage and it doesn't have a good clean path back to ground, it's not going to work the way it's supposed to. Now, the difference or the challenge becomes on these is that there's typically multiple power and ground sources. And unless you have a really good schematic or you have some engineering background, you may not necessarily know which ones go with which. Yes, you can test it like we did this example with the headlight by back probing the connectors with the ECM or the electronic control module powered up. But again, you have to test it under a variety of conditions, won't you? For example, on the ECM on the truck, we have to check it key off, engine off. We need to check it when engine is running, and we even need to check one of the circuits under cranking. But these are all things that you can determine when you're looking at the schematic drawing. And we're not sure which ground goes to what. So I may have my meter in the right place on the power side, but then I'm going to have to start going through all the grounds, and then it comes to be a little confusing, doesn't it? Here's a little easier way to do it. The first thing you're going to need is a substitute load, because the idea is to test the circuit integrity, all we really need is a load that's going to create current flow through the circuit, right? And if we have a load that's creating that current flow, we can perform a voltage drop on that load and still determine if there's a problem on either side, right? It's no different than what we just did on the board. In fact, I'm going to use the same component. All I did is I took a little headlight and I put some alligator clamps on one end, and then so we're going to need that. Of course, we're going to need our meter. And again, I'm going to use the millivolt scale just like we did on our test. We're going to do the positive to positive, negative to negative in order to determine what's each circuit path, whether we have a go or no-go issue. And then the next thing we're going to need, you're going to need a way to insert your meter leads into the connector for the module you want to test. And there's going to be different style of connectors, isn't there? You've already run into that situation. It's a test lead kit. And here's an example. This is one that's produced by the folks over at ASE Wave. It's got a lot more stuff than just the test leads, but there's one of the things I like about it is that there's a variety of sources or leads, for example, that allow me to back probe, or not back probe, but be able to remove the connector and insert the proper size pin into that connector, and then I can make my connection to my substitute load, and I'm not going to do any damage to the connector, okay? So we're going to use that as part of today's test too. The next thing we're going to need is we need to look at the schematic. We need to look at the schematic for, in this case, the engine management system, and we need to look at the pinouts for the ECM so we can identify the grounds and the power sources. And on the power sources, where's that power coming from? Under what conditions is that power source going to be powered up? Again, we have a fused battery wire, for example, on here that's key on, engine off, power all the time. But there's also a few other circuits that are going to require us to have the engine running and even cranking in order to check all of the power and ground sources to that module, all right? So now that we have that surmised what we're going to do, let's start with the first thing that I want to test. After I have the sources of power and ground identified on the schematic, I can look further into my service information system and I can find the pinouts for the connectors, so that I can properly identify where I'm going to place my probes. Make sure that you follow the service information system. If they suggest that you disconnect the battery before you disconnect the control module, please do so. It's not unusual to have some type of, what's the word I'm looking for? You may have a spark across the terminals as you're disconnecting. That could create a voltage spike in the control module itself. May not cause a problem today, but it could cause an issue, a month, a year down the road from creating a hotspot on that circuit board. So that's just a precaution to take. Check your service information. Make sure you do, as always, the job the way it's supposed to be done. So I'm going to go ahead and get the camera a little closer now so I can show you what we're doing. And we'll show you how we're going to test the ground side first and why. All right, I've identified that one of the power supplies is fused battery voltage. In other words, there's power there all the time. Of course, on the engine control module, that's the keep alive memory. That's what keeps all the settings in place so they don't disappear on us when we shut the key off. That's pin, according to the pinout diagram, pin 96. That's this terminal here. And there are 5 grounds that we're going to test, starting here in the second row at pins 49, 50, 51, 52, and finally 53. And that's where we're going to start with this. Now, why? Well, I know I've got fused battery here, so I don't have to worry about what condition the key is on. And if I can verify that all the grounds are okay, it's going to make checking the power side a little bit easier to understand. Now, the other thing that comes into play is that 99% of the time, it's a ground side issue that's causing your problem. It's not common for the problem to be on the positive side. You're going to find most of your issues ground side related. So we're going to go ahead and start with that. Now that I have these in place, I'm going to take my substitute load and I'm going to put it in place on positive to positive, and then I'm going to connect up the ground side. And now my headlight is lit. Now we'll go ahead and perform the voltage drop test. Okay, so now with the headlights hooked up, I'm going to go ahead and set the scale on millivolts. And now we're going to check the ground side. So remember, ground side, I'm going to check negative meter lead on the ground side of the battery, and my positive meter lead will go to the ground of the headlight load. So we're going to start off with the first. Right, there's that. 103 millivolts. Okay, that's only a tenth of a volt, right? So let's switch that over so you can see that a little easier. Tenth of a volt. So that's okay. Not going to worry about that. And then all we're going to do now is go down the other grounds. Go to the next pin on this one. Measure that. 0.1. Number 3. 0.1. Number 4. 0.1. And finally, number 5. 0.1. Now I need to check the positive side. We just verified that all the ground side is all the grounds are okay, right? So we don't have any problem with those. So now we need to check to make sure that that B plus voltage is going to be correct. So I'm going to remove my lead down here at the bottom for the time being. Now we're going to just switch around like we did before. Remember, positive to positive when we're checking the positive side of the circuit. Move the negative meter lead over to the positive side of the battery. And now I'm going to move my positive meter lead to the B plus pin, or the positive side of the headlight load. Okay, 0.16. Now let me show you how I'm actually measuring the load. Okay, so we're back to the load. Again, we're checking the positive side of the circuit, but what I want to point out here is I'm right here at the pin. Right? I'm right here at the pin, and I'm also, when I'm testing grounds, I'm right here at this pin. But Pete, you said you need to get as close to the load as possible, and those wires are going all the way up to the headlight. Well, let me show you what happens when we move there. Okay, I just want to make this as a point here. Right now I'm still set up to measure the positive side of the load, or the ground, or the positive side of the circuit rather. I'm going to leave it on the voltage scale, and I'm just going to go to, we're just going to find a spot to just kind of tap into the positive side of the circuit, and we'll see what kind of reading we get. Really close to the headlight. There you go, look at that. That's like 0.8 of a volt. That's kind of high. But what's the difference? I'm coming across this joint here. Let's talk about that a little bit. Let me just talk a little bit about what you just saw. That's a really good real-world example of something you might face in your bay when you start applying this technique. I told you when you're going to do a voltage drop test, you want to get as close to the load as possible so that you can test the entire path from power or to ground. And that's true. You want to do that. If I had started at the headlight, we would have measured almost a volt. That would have been enough for me to raise my eyebrows if I was suspecting a problem with the ECM itself. That may not be a clean enough ground for the low current circuits that the ECM contains. But what is our next step if we suspect there's a problem? We want to find that source of extra resistance. We start narrowing the distance, don't we, between where our meter leads are. So if I'm at the load and I'm trying to get to the battery, I'm going to start moving closer and closer to the battery until my meter reading returns to normal. The meter readings that we got right at that little connector splice were down to 1/10 of a volt. Is that a more normal reading? You bet it is. So where's the source of my extra 7/8 of a volt? It's in the section of wiring in my substitute load. Anywhere between the alligator clips I have on the end, to the splice joints I have here, to the pin connectors here. Somewhere in there is the source of that resistance, okay? I'm not worried about that though, because it's not a part of the ECM's normal path to ground. This is just a test device. So once I've eliminated, or once I've determined that this was the cause of the reading itself, I'm not worried about that. I got 1/10 of a volt down there, I'm fine. If I want to measure up from there from the get-go, if you can access it, you can reach it, fine. Why did the resistance change on this? I can only think it's because of how hot it was getting. Headlight's hot, drawing a lot of current. This isn't exactly the heaviest gauge wiring. Maybe that's a solution for me. But I just want to point out that I don't care. This is a means to an end. And if I know that I have to move my way back to the load, if I go verify it right there at the connector where the true ground path for the ECM starts, and I see that I have no problem, I'm done. Speaking of done, that's going to do it for this edition of The Trainer. I'll see you next month.